From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The presidential debates are the gatekeepers to credibility. If a third-party candidate gets in, he's instantly deemed credible, viable, worthy of voter attention, and worthy of media attention. But if he's excluded, he's dismissed as marginal, unworthy of voter attention or media attention, and his campaign is relegated in many ways to the dustbins of history. As
President Obama and Mitt Romney prepare for tonight's town hall debate with audience questions pre-selected by moderator Candy Crowley of CNN, we look at the debate's form and content with George Farah, founder of Open Debates, and Guardian columnist Glenn Greenwald on the U.S. presidential debate's illusion of political choice. Then two leaders of the Chilean student movement, which has led the largest protests since the days of Augusto Pinochet a generation ago.
We saw several riots, the biggest one of them all last year. Over 1 million people on the streets, more than 6 months of student strike. Many students in the high school lost their academic year.
Yo creo que hoy día, a propósito de eso,
I think that our biggest challenge now is that we don't only need the democratization of education, but the democratization of the entire country.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Obama and Republican challenger Mitt Romney are heading to Long Island today for their second presidential debate. Tonight's debate at Hofstra University comes just 3 weeks before the general election. It'll include both foreign and domestic policy issues in a town hall setting that gives undecided voters in the audience the opportunity to question the candidates. The final debate will be next Monday in Boca Raton, Florida, and will focus on foreign policy issues. We'll have more on the debate after headlines. The New York Times is reporting the Pentagon and State Department are speeding up efforts to help the Libyan government create an elite commando force to help counter the country's fractious militias. Under the plan, U.S. Special Operations Forces would train about 500 Libyan troops. According to a Pentagon document, the Libyan commando force will be designed to, quote, counter and defeat terrorist and violent extremist organizations. On Monday, Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton assumed responsibility for last month's deadly attack on the U.S. diplomatic mission in Benghazi, Libya. UN Arab League envoy Lakhdar Brahimi has called for a ceasefire in Syria during the upcoming Muslim holiday of Eid al-Adha. Brahimi made the call while he was in Iraq after holding talks in Iran. Brahimi said the conflict in Syria represents a threat to world peace, but denied he's seeking peacekeepers for the country. Meanwhile, Turkish officials have announced more than 100,000 Syrian refugees are now living in the country. Ejdar Kaya is the president of the Turkish Disaster Management Agency.
As of today, we do have indeed more than 100,000 refugees in Turkey. Indeed, we call them as our guests, indeed, because we treat them as our guests. So we do have almost 13 camps up and running as of today again, and we do have other camps under construction. We are trying our best, indeed, to get ready for those who are in need for shelter and for humanitarian needs, indeed.
The European Union has announced sweeping new sanctions against the Iranian banking and energy sectors, cranking up financial pressure on Tehran. EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton said she hopes the new sanctions will draw Iran into serious negotiations on its nuclear program. Humanitarian groups are warning the sanctions could have a devastating impact on the Iranian civilian population. Meanwhile, the United States and Israel are preparing to begin their largest joint air and missile defense exercise. As many as 3,500 U.S. personnel and 1,000 members of the Israeli Defense Forces are expected to take part in the 3-week exercise. Britain and Germany will also participate. In news from Guantanamo, a U.S. military judge refused to allow a discussion about torture during a pretrial hearing Monday in the death penalty case against 5 prisoners, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind of the September 11th attacks. Before their transfer to the Guantanamo U.S. Naval Base in 2006, the defendants were held for years in secret CIA prisons where all 5 have said they were tortured during interrogations. David Nevin is an attorney for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
I'm talking about the United States of America. Tortured my client for 3.5 years. It's a capital case. Do you think that's something I might want to talk to Mr. Mohammed about? Well, of course it is. But there, defined as contraband in the rules, is, quote, unquote, the detention of any detainee.
Attorney David Nevin went on to criticize the overall court proceedings at Guantanamo.
It is a court that is designed to achieve a conviction and to do it in such a way that the truth never comes out about what was done to our client, who did it, and why, and what it means.
Thousands of protesters gathered outside the Portuguese parliament Monday night to protest sweeping austerity cuts and tax hikes in the country's budget for next year. The harsh new budget draft aimed at meeting the strict conditions of a massive European bailout would see the average income tax rise by more than 3%. About 2,000 protesters gathered Monday night to protest the budget and demand the resignation of the government.
I'm here today, like everyone else, protesting against the 2013 budget and against the government, which is always implementing new measures that don't make any sense, and they don't live up to them.
The Guardian reports a U.S. businessman has dumped about 100 metric tons of iron sulfate into the ocean off the Canadian coast as part of a risky for-profit geoengineering venture that appears to violate 2 international resolutions. California businessman Russ George dumped the iron to spark an artificial plankton bloom that now appears to stretch up to 10,000 square kilometers. The plankton's supposed to absorb carbon dioxide as part of a controversial tactic called ocean fertilization that could produce profitable carbon credits. But scientists have raised concerns the process could irreparably damage ocean life and might even worsen global warming. George has previously failed to conduct similar dumps near the Galapagos and Canary Islands, prompting the Spanish and Ecuadorian governments to bar his vessels. The recent dump happened in July off the west coast of Canada, where the head of the local Haida Nation said it was touted as a salmon enhancement project. The Haida Nation president said the local people would have rejected the project if they'd known of any potential negative consequences to the ocean. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration has announced September 2012 was tied for the warmest September on record worldwide. September marked the 331st month in a row with a global temperature above the 20th century average. The last below-average temperature for any month was February 1985. The American Civil Liberties Union has filed a class-action discrimination lawsuit against Morgan Stanley for peddling predatory subprime loans to African-American borrowers in Detroit. The lawsuit alleges Morgan Stanley lent billions of dollars to New Century, a now-defunct subprime lender, and pressured it to make loans to borrowers who could not afford them. Morgan Stanley later packaged the loans and sold them to pension funds and other large investors. Cuba's announced it'll scrap broad travel restrictions to make it easier for Cubans to travel abroad. For the first time in 50 years, Cubans will no longer need to obtain an exit visa and letter of invitation in order to leave the island. Beginning in January, Cubans will be allowed to simply show a passport and a visa from the country they're traveling to, if needed. The head of a soup kitchen in Ohio has accused Republican vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan and campaign staffers of ramrodding their way into the soup kitchen so that Ryan could get his picture taken washing dishes in the dining hall. According to news accounts, Ryan arrived at the soup kitchen after the food had been served, the patrons had left, and the hall had been cleaned. Photos show Ryan washing dishes that had reportedly already been cleaned. Brian Antall, president of the Mahoning County St. Vincent de Paul Society, criticized the Ryan team for using the soup kitchen for a staged photo op. Antall said, quote, "They showed up there and they did not have permission. They got one of the volunteers to open the doors. The photo op they did wasn't even accurate. He did nothing. He just came in here to get his picture taken at the dining hall," he said. And in New York, 2 police officers are under investigation after video emerged showing them brutally beating a young man inside a Jewish community center in Brooklyn. The officers claimed 21-year-old Ehud Halevi had attacked them during the incident last week. But surveillance video appears to contradict that claim. Instead, it shows one officer punching Halevi in the head, then delivering repeated blows, while a second officer appears to be holding him down. The second officer also beats Halevi with her baton for more than 2 minutes. Police had reportedly been called to the Alternative Learning Institute for Young Adults when Halevi refused to leave after a center volunteer found him sleeping on a couch. But a center director said Halevi had permission to sleep there. He was charged with felony assault on police and 3 misdemeanors. Since the video emerged, the New York Police Department and Brooklyn District Attorney's Office have both opened investigations. One of the officers, Luis Vega, has been placed on modified duty. New York State Assemblyman Dov Hikind condemned the beating.
This behavior is unconscionable, and if not for the video camera to record what happened, we might actually believe that Ehud attacked the police officers, and he never did. He's charged with felonies. He's charged with all kinds of crimes. And now I wonder how many other times are New Yorkers charged with serious crimes, and there is no video camera to tell the story.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. President Obama and Republican challenger Mitt Romney will hold their second debate tonight at Hofstra University on Long Island. President Obama faces increasing pressure after what many deemed a lackluster performance during the first debate in Denver, Colorado earlier this month. The Romney campaign has since received a boost in the polls and raised a record $170 million in September. Recent polls show the rivals are tied. An ABC News Washington Post survey released Monday suggested 49% of voters are for the Democratic president, while 46% support his Republican rival. On the campaign trail over the last week, Obama slammed Romney for recanting on many of his previous positions.
These days, Mitt Romney's for whatever you're for. Suddenly he loves the middle class. Can't stop talking enough about him. He loves Medicare, loves teachers. He even loves the most important parts of Obamacare. What happened?
Meanwhile, Republican vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan campaigned in his home state of Wisconsin and attacked the president for his handling of the national debt.
The president came into office saying he would cut the deficit in half in his first term. He's given us 4 years of trillion-dollar deficits. He has added almost more public debt than almost all previous presidents combined.
During this election season, as the Republican and Democratic candidates square off in the official debates, Democracy Now! Has broken the sound barrier by expanding the debates to include the voices of third-party presidential contenders who were shut out, giving them equal time to respond. Tonight's debate is the first this election to use the town hall format, featuring questions moderator Candy Crowley of CNN. She selects from the audience. Detail revealed when Time magazine published the contract secretly negotiated by the Obama and Romney campaigns that dictates the term of the 2012 presidential debates. Tonight, Democracy Now! Will continue our expanded coverage, this time from Hofstra University, where the debate is being held. We'll host a community roundtable with guests from Long Island and air the full uninterrupted debate between President Obama and Mitt Romney. From 10:30 to 11, we'll broadcast post-debate analysis. And tomorrow on Democracy Now! We'll play excerpts of the town hall meeting today and include third-party candidates also, in addition to Mitt Romney and President Obama answering the questions. Our guests in studio will be Jill Stein, the Green Party presidential candidate. As well, we'll be joined by Rocky Anderson, the Justice Party presidential candidate, and Virgil Good of the Constitution Party. But right now, to talk more about the debates themselves, we're joined by two guests. George Faris, the founder and executive director of Open Debates. He's also author of No Debate, How the Republican and Democratic Parties Secretly Control the Presidential Debates. And we're joined by Glenn Greenwald on the West Coast, columnist and blogger for The Guardian newspaper, author of With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! George, let's begin with you. Last night, the contract between the campaigns was released for this debate. Talk about it. How long is it? What did you learn? How significant is it?
This is a 21-page contract that was negotiated by the Republican and Democratic parties, by the Obama campaign and the Romney campaign, and it dictates the terms of the presidential debates that we're seeing this election season. This contract was not made public in 2008. It was made public in 3 prior election seasons only because we got copies from whistleblowers. So this is a fantastic primary document to see just how much the Republican and Democratic campaigns manipulate the process. And there are some fascinating provisions that are harmful to our democratic process. First and foremost, the contract actually says that the candidates cannot participate in any other debate with any other candidate and any other sponsor. We had 27 Republican primary debates. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debated 7 times in 1858, but we're only having 3 presidential debates precisely because the candidates have contractually prohibited themselves from participating in any other forum. And it gives the Commission on Presidential Debates a de facto monopoly over our most important election forums. Instead of allowing other organizations like the League of Women Voters to host exciting debates that might include some possible third-party voices, the Commission is in total control of this process and allows the Republican and Democratic nominees to negotiate these very kinds of detailed contracts that eliminate spontaneity from some of the formats and exclude all viable third-party voices.
George Fair, can you explain how was this contract revealed if in the previous instances it was only through whistleblowers?
Time Magazine's David Halpern actually managed to get a copy of the contract. We don't know how, but it was leaked. It wasn't by virtue of the Commission operating with transparency.
Mark Halpern.
I'm sorry, Mark Halpern, yes. The Commission survives on the lack of transparency. In fact, the Commission was denying this contract even existed. Mike McCurry, the former press secretary to President Bill Clinton, is one of the co-chairs of the Commission on Presidential Debates. And he repeatedly denied the very existence of this contract. When we confronted the executive director of the Commission, Janet Brown, about the existence of a contract that's dictating the terms of the debates, she said there is no such contract. The Commission is not a party to it. Once some of the features of the contract started to come out, the Commission then said, well, the contract is only about podium heights and temperatures in auditoriums and whether the candidates can wear risers in their shoes, but denied that there was any substance. Now that we're actually seeing the contract, we're seeing that for tonight's town hall format, there are extraordinary restrictions that are preventing them there from being more unpredictable questions. We're seeing the exclusion, of course, of all third-party voices according to the candidate selection criteria, and we're seeing the prohibition on additional debates. We're facing an unemployment crisis. We're facing complex foreign policy issues. Why are we rationing debates, which are really the best antidote to money in our political process?
You've been on before talking about the Commission on Presidential Debates, what this is, but if you can once again just review how we came to this point in electoral politics, how the League of Women Voters had control of these debates wrested from them.
The League of Women Voters ran the presidential debate process from 1976 until 1984, and they were a very courageous and genuinely independent, nonpartisan sponsor. And whenever the candidates attempted to manipulate the presidential debates behind closed doors, either to exclude a viable independent candidate or to sanitize the formats, the League had the courage to challenge the Republican Democratic nominees and, if necessary, go public. In 1980, independent candidate John B. Anderson was polling about 12% of the polls. The League insisted that Anderson be allowed to participate because the vast majority of the American people wanted to see him. But Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, refused to debate him. The League went forward anyway and held a presidential debate with an empty chair showing that Jimmy Carter wasn't going to show up. 4 years later, when the Republican Democratic nominees tried to get rid of difficult questions by vetoing 80 of the moderators that they had proposed to host the debates, the League said this is unacceptable. They held a press conference and attacked the campaigns for trying to get rid of difficult questions. And lastly, in 1988 was the first attempt by the Republican and Democratic campaigns to negotiate a detailed contract. It was tame by comparison, a mere 12 pages. It talked about who could be in the audience and how the format would be structured. But the League found that kind of lack of transparency and that kind of candidate control to be fundamentally outrageous and antithetical to our democratic process. They released the contract and stated they refused to be an accessory to the hoodwinking of the American people and refused to implement it. And today, what do we have? We have a private corporation that was created by the Republican Democratic parties called the Commission on Presidential Debates. It seized control of the presidential debates precisely because the League was independent, precisely because this women's organization had the guts to stand up to the candidates that the major party candidates had nominated. And instead of making public these contracts and resisting the major party candidates' manipulations, the Commission allows the candidates to negotiate these 21-page contracts that dictate all the fundamental terms of the debates.
But who runs the Commission and who funds it?
The Commission is co-chaired by two individuals, Frank Fahrenkopf and Mike McCurry. Frank Fahrenkopf is the former chair of the Republican Party and the nation's leading gambling lobbyist. He's the president of the American Gaming Association. And Mike McCurry is the former press secretary to Bill Clinton.
Well, it's a good bet for both parties.
Exactly. And he's also the lobbying on behalf of the telecommunications industry. These are men who have demonstrated repeatedly a willingness to sacrifice our democratic process for what they perceive to be either financial interest or political interest. And the Commission is largely financed by private corporations. The entity that's given the most amount of money to the Commission on Presidential Debates is Anheuser-Busch. Our presidential debates are brought to you by Bud Light. And they've given millions of dollars to the Commission on Presidential Debates.
But what do these corporations stand to gain from funding the Commission and the debates?
First, they just nice advertising, of course. They get to, Philip Morris sponsored one of the presidential debates, paid $250,000 and got to hang its banner in the post-debate spin room that was seen throughout the country. But more importantly, they get access, and they get to show support for both major parties.
The major parties on their podiums have Bud Light on the podium.
Not yet. We're getting there. We're getting there. But they get to show support for both major parties. How often can corporations find a way to make a single donation that strengthens both the Republican and Democratic parties and get a tax deduction for that kind of donation? So it's a rare contribution, and it also gives them access. They get to go to the actual debate themselves and rub shoulders at private receptions with the campaigns and their staff.
The CEOs of these companies, like the International Bottled Water Association.
Exactly. It's fascinating that liquids are the principal sponsorship of the presidential debates this year.
Well, after the contract was revealed yesterday, a member of the Commission, Newton Minow, and the former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission defended the criteria, at least for the exclusion of the vast majority of candidates. He said there are 410 candidates, let me repeat, he said, 410 candidates for president registered with the Federal Election Commission. Do you really want to have 410 candidates in the debate? Is that right? There are that many, and that's what, if inclusion were not restricted in the way that the Commission has restricted it, would all of these candidates have to participate in the debate?
Absolutely not. And this is part of the Commission's propaganda. They like to say every 4 years that hundreds of candidates run for president every 4 years, including Joe Crustacean of the Crustacean Liberation Party that wants lobsters to colonize the moon. He runs every 4 years. But these candidates are not on enough state ballots to come close to having a mathematical chance of winning the White House. If you just say, let's include all the candidates in this election cycle that are actually on enough state ballots to have a chance to actually win the White House, we have 4, maybe 5 candidates in total, and that's including Obama and Romney. We had 7, 8 candidates in the Republican primaries, so even having the most liberal candidate selection criteria would only result in 5 candidates. And if you ask the American people, if we're going to use polling to actually determine who gets to participate in the debates, which is what the Commission does, the Commission says a candidate must reach 15% in the polls to participate in the presidential debates, which, if you apply that criteria historically, excludes every third-party candidate for the last 100 years from any conceivable presidential debate. But if we're going to use polling criteria, why not simply ask the American people, who do you want included in the presidential debates?
Speaking on MSNBC's Morning Joe on Monday, Mark Halperin said both the Obama and Romney campaigns had expressed concerns about the role of the moderator in tonight's town hall session.
Candy Crowley, who's moderating the town hall on Tuesday, has got a unique challenge as compared to the other moderators. The Commission and the campaigns want this to be driven by the questions that come from the people chosen by Gallup to ask questions, citizens who are likely voters. And both campaigns have been struck, as has the Commission, by some of the interviews that Candy has done, talking about her role and what she envisions her role to be. The campaigns and the Commission envision a much more limited role than they've heard her describe. And things are a bit in flux, it's clear that the campaigns have asked the commission, as I report, to check with Candy to say, do you get the fact that we think this should be a very limited role, very few follow-ups, basically just traffic cop after an audience question. And it remains a little bit unclear at this point about if she envisions this role the way the commission and the campaigns do, or whether she wants to play a more active role in following up after they've answered the question from the citizen.
That's Mark Halperin of Time, who released the contract between the Obama and Romney campaigns, George Farah, talking about the candidates' concerns about the role Candy Crowley will play.
The town hall debate we're going to see tonight is the most constrained and regulated town hall debate in presidential debate history. The first town hall debate was introduced in 1992, and no one knew what anyone was going to ask. None of the audience members were going to ask. The moderator could ask any follow-up questions. It was exciting and it was real. Well, President George H.W. Bush stumbled in response to an oddly worded question about the federal deficit, and the campaigns have panicked and have attempted to avoid that kind of situation from happening again. In 1996, they abolished follow-up questions from the audience. In 2004, they began requiring that every single question asked by the audience be submitted in advance on an index card to the moderator, who can then throw out the ones he or she does not like. And that's why the audience has essentially been reduced in some ways to props, because the moderator is still ultimately asking the questions. And this election cycle is the first time that the moderator herself is prohibited from asking follow-up questions, questions seeking clarification. She's essentially reduced to keeping time and being a lady with a microphone.
It's interesting you say that, because Carol Simpson was just on from ABC talking about what the role of women in these debates. You had Martha Raddatz, who was the questioner of the vice presidential candidates, not the presidential candidates, and then Candy Crowley holding the microphone. Now, of course, she can choose the questions this morning as she's going to be reviewing them, and the person who's called on, I suppose, doesn't have to ask that question.
No, we don't know. Exactly. Who knows what kind of spontaneity is going to happen. But there is something ugly about having the League of Women Voters losing control of the presidential debates to the commission, co-chaired by two men who then reduce all female moderators to kind of sideshows and trivializing their role in the actual presidential debates.
We're going to come back to this discussion. We're talking to George Farah. He's Executive Director of Open Debates. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We'll be joined by Glenn Greenwald as well when we come back.
I fall off my chair, and I'm wondering how I'll get down the stairs. Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. Yes, I'm stuck in the middle with you, and I'm wondering what it is I should do. It's so hard to keep the smile from my face. Losing control, yeah, I'm all over the place. Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. When you started out with nothing and you're proud that you're a self-made man, and your fans they all come crawling, slap you on the back and say, please.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guests are George Farah of Open Debate and Glenn Greenwald, who just wrote a very interesting piece about how who gets to ask the questions. He's author of the book With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. But his piece in The Guardian is the one we want to talk about. Let's turn to a question by moderator Martha Raddatz during the vice presidential debate when she asked the two candidates, Paul Ryan and Vice President Joe Biden, this question.
Let's talk about Medicare and entitlements. Both Medicare and Social Security are going broke and taking a larger share of the budget in the process. Will benefits for Americans under these programs have to change for the programs to survive?
Glenn Greenwald, can you comment on the question?
Well, the question is grounded on an assumption that is not just dubious, but very vociferously debated among the nation's leading economists, which is the idea that Social Security and Medicare are going broke. In the case of Social Security, it's almost impossible to make the case that it actually is going broke. The Social Security actually makes money. To the extent that it is burdened with debt, it's because other government programs, whether it be military spending or all kinds of corporate cronyism, create all kinds of debt that Social Security essentially ends up funding. And with regard to Medicare, the same thing. Lots of economists have pointed out that Medicare, with a few minor alterations, will be economically sound for many decades. This notion that it's going broke is something that lots of right-wing billionaires have promulgated as a way of pressuring Americans into feeling like they have to give up their basic entitlements. And so to watch Martha Raddatz posing as an objective journalist, embracing what is an extremely controversial premise in her question, and then watching both candidates accept that assumption rather than challenge them, sort of is the microcosm of how these debates work, which is they pose as objective, neutral moderators designed to have this wide-ranging debate, when in reality it takes place within a very suffocating, small confine of ideas. And as George has been detailing, that's what it's designed to do.
Well, I want to turn, Glenn, to another question that was raised during the debate, and this one on foreign policy. This is, again, moderator Martha Raddatz asking the candidates about Iran.
Let's move to Iran. I'd actually like to move to Iran because there's really no bigger national security this country is facing. Both President Obama and Governor Romney have said they will prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, even if that means military action. Last week, former Defense Secretary Bob Gates said a strike on Iran's facilities would not work and, quote, could prove catastrophic, haunting us for generations. Can the two of you be absolutely clear and specific to the American people? How effective would a military strike be?
Glenn Greenwald, your comments on the Iran question.
Right. Well, there again, you see the core assumption of her question, the idea that there is no greater national security. It's unclear if she said issue or threat. I think she just left out the word, but what she was clearly asserting was that in terms of the array of national security challenges America faces, Iran is the most important at the top of the list. This idea is ludicrous. It's laughable. Iran has a minuscule military budget when compared to the United States. It is surrounded militarily, has been encircled by the United States for a decade. It has no capability to attack the United States, has demonstrated no propensity to do so, and would be, as Hillary Clinton once infamously said, obliterated, instantly destroyed if it tried. So this idea that they pose any kind of national security threat to the United States is one of those myths that has been used to keep fear levels high, to justify continuous military spending and all sorts of abridgments at home to get the Americans to think we need to be in endless war. And here is the neutral moderator embracing that premise, though it's not even debatable, as what will shape the entire Iran discussion. Moreover, the question that she asked, if you noticed, was strictly about the efficacy of military strikes. Will a military strike on Iran advance American interests? Will it achieve strategic goals? Whether the United States has the legal and moral right to attack Iran, whether it will create all kinds of havoc in the world, whether this will cause millions and millions and millions of Muslims to hate the United States even more, is something that is just never considered, because the assumption that the United States has the legal and moral right to attack Iran is something that both the Republican and Democratic parties agree on and don't even debate by excluding third-party candidates to ensure that that's not even in question. The same is true for the sanctions regime. Both parties, both candidates competed to say who supported a stronger sanctions regime, which of course is causing extreme suffering for the Iranian people, the way the sanctions regime in Iraq for a decade not only caused suffering but killed hundreds of thousands. That too is completely excluded from the debate. So you don't just have third-party candidates being excluded as a result of these rules. What you have is the vast bulk of political opinions and political facts being excluded, because these moderators are chosen very specifically to ensure that they will embrace only the orthodoxy shared by both parties while posing as objective, neutral, non-ideological actors.
Glenn, we're going to reconnect with you, so we're going to drop our Democracy Now! Video connection with you and go for a moment to the clip of third-party candidates. because Democracy Now! Broke the sound barrier with the first presidential debate when we expanded the debate live in real time to include responses from third-party presidential contenders who were shut out of the official event. You know, the first debate was at University of Denver. We were just down the road in Littleton at a Comcast studio with similar podiums with a blue backdrop, just like the presidential candidates had. And after Jim Lehrer asked the question to President Obama, gave him 2 minutes, then to Mitt Romney, gave him 2 minutes, we'd stop the tape and we'd say, Dr. Jill Stein, presidential candidate of the Green Party, you've got 2 minutes. And we put the same question to Rocky Anderson. I want to play an excerpt of Jill Stein's response to moderator Jim Lehrer's question about so-called entitlement programs and Social Security.
It's very important to point out that while we hear a very different narrative from Barack Obama and the Democrats than we do from Mitt Romney, with Mitt Romney's narrative being usually harsh, scary, selfishness on steroids, and the Democratic narrative being warm and fuzzy and we're all in this together, let's just wait for things to get better. You know, it's really important to look beyond the talk, to look at the walk, to look at what's actually being proposed. And Jeffrey Sachs at the University of Columbia has pointed out in his analysis of the budget proposals of both Obama and of Romney-Ryan, points out that they're both aiming for essentially the same targets. They're both aiming for Social Security to be about 5% of GDP some years down the line, whether it's 4 or 8 years. And on Medicare, they're both aiming for Medicare to be reduced to about 3.2% of GDP. So the point is, while they have different scenarios, they both have the same targets.
That was Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. This is Rocky Anderson of the Justice Party responding to a question about health care reform.
About Obamacare and Romney care. I would call it insurance company care because they're the ones that wrote it. They joined up with a very conservative foundation years ago to develop this plan to make the American people buy this perverse product. Again, we're the only country in the world that depends upon for-profit insurance companies for the majority of our coverage for health care, for those who are lucky enough to have it. There are now over 50 million people without basic health care coverage in this country. The latest report indicates that there will be over 30 million people without essential health care coverage when Obamacare is fully implemented. That means misery, it means extended disease, it means extended illness and injuries, and it means the loss of lives.
That was Rocky Anderson of the Justice Party. And both Jill Stein of the Green Party and Rocky Anderson of the Justice Party and Virgil Goode of the Constitution Party will be joining in the debate at the town hall, not tonight at Hofstra, but when we expand the debate tomorrow on Democracy Now! In a special 2-hour broadcast called Expanding the Debate. And we're hoping stations will take it around the country, or you can also go to democracynow.org. Glenn, let's just talk to you on the phone right now. Glenn Greenwald, when you listen to these candidates giving their responses, third-party candidates, your thoughts?
Well, I think you see exactly why it is that those candidates have been excluded, and I think actually what you're doing in having these debates in a way that includes them is really quite innovative and important and really brilliant because it illustrates two things. Number one is when you have these candidates on the stage who are credible, who as George said, represent parties who have ballot access and have been funded and recognized by lots of people, what it does is it illustrates just how mythological this idea is that the Democrats and Republicans are universes apart, that in reality they share all kinds of policy premises and most importantly serve exactly the same interests. Only by excluding those candidates and having the two parties focus on the tiny differences that they have and vociferously fight about them can this mythology be maintained that we have massive and real choice in this country. The other aspect of it is that if you have, for example, Gary Johnson, who is the Libertarian Party candidate, and even a couple of other candidates on the right, right, who oftentimes are far greater advocates of what progressives have long claimed to be their values: anti-war, pro-civil liberties, anti-harsh penal policies, anti-drug war. What then begins to happen as well is that the ideological and partisan spectrum begins to blur a great deal. Loyalties break down, cultural identities can be subverted, and that more than anything is what the two parties do not want. They want both of their followers to think that the only way that these views can be represented is by clinging to either one of the two political parties, and introducing these third parties into the debate shows that actually the ideological spectrum is far less rigid and linear than these two parties insist on perpetuating. And that's why they're joined together at the hip and have a common interest in keeping this process as it is, and why this collusion exists so smoothly, as George described, because they both want to keep these candidates out for the same reasons.
George Farah, do you think that form determines content?
In many ways, yes. The exclusion of these viable third-party candidates from these kinds of actual presidential debate processes have the consequence of a certain ideological containment that Glenn is describing. Third parties are responsible for the abolition of slavery, women's right to vote, child labor laws, unemployment compensation, Social Security, direct election of senators, public schools, public power. The list goes on. And when you exclude those third-party voices by structuring the debate in such an exclusionary format, you're preventing third parties from actually breaking the bipartisan silence on critical issues and doing exactly what Glenn is saying, which is presenting a narrow bandwidth in a wide manner, presenting the illusion that there's extraordinary difference between the parties when, in fact, there's
Ralph Nader was almost arrested when he went to one of these presidential debates, when he was running for president.
In 2000, 64% of the American people wanted to see Ralph Nader in the presidential debates. He was on the ballot in the vast majority of states, but when he got a ticket to watch the debate in a viewing audience room adjacent to the debate stadium, he was escorted by police out of the actual presidential debate arena. Ultimately, he filed a lawsuit, and the Commission on Presidential Debates had to issue a formal apology and make a $25,000 donation to a pro-democracy organization.
Glenn Greenwald, you've also talked about the fact that the vast majority of the most consequential issues facing the United States today will not be addressed during this debate process. Can you talk about some of those issues that will be and have been excluded?
Oh, yes. I mean, the list of consequential issues that will be completely ignored by these debates because the two parties agree on them is vastly longer than the list of issues that they disagree on and will be talked about. Obviously, if you look at foreign policy, you see President Obama engaging in endless war, attacking various countries with drones, killing innocent people, claiming the right to assassinate American citizens without a whiff of transparency or due process, waging an unprecedented war on whistleblowers in the United States here at home, prosecuting more than all previous presidents combined. The United States is this vast, massive penal state where we imprison more of our fellow citizens than any other country in the world. We have a policy of punishing people for drug usage that is racist in both its application and design, putting huge numbers of minorities into prison for no good reason. There's massive poverty in the United States, a huge and exploding income gap in between the rich and the poor, greatest in many decades. None of these issues will be remotely addressed because there's nothing for the two parties to say on them other than the fact that we agree. And it's by excluding those issues, some of the most consequential policy debates that the United States faces, including things like union rights and climate change, the list goes on. Only by ignoring them can this myth be maintained that the two parties have some vastly different philosophical approach, and it's the inclusion of third-party candidates who would insist on talking about those that would give the lie to this mythology.
Glenn Greenwald, I want to turn to another issue, a foreign policy issue confronting the U.S., which is that the ACLU is at Guantanamo Bay this week to attend the pretrial hearings before a U.S. military commission in the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his 4 co-defendants. The 5 are charged with conspiring in the attacks of September 11, 2001, and may face the death penalty if convicted. The ACLU hopes to block a so-called protective order that would prevent the revelation of classified details gathered during the defendant's CIA interrogations. ACLU attorney Hina Shamsi told the Associated Press, quote, "What we are challenging is the censorship of the defendant's testimony based on their personal knowledge of the government's torture and detention of them." Glenn Greenwald, can you talk about some of the concerns around this pretrial hearing?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say that this story perfectly illustrates everything that we were just talking about, because 4 years ago, issues like military commissions and the way in which the government cheated in these cases by denying due process and trying to ensure guilt through these joke tribunals were widely debated. These were constantly talked about, and that's because the Democrats pretended to have a different view than the Republicans. The Democrats opposed them. The Republicans favored them, and so you had conflict and controversy over them, and therefore they were included in the debate. 4 years later, you have the Democrats fully on board with all of the injustices that President Obama and his party pretended to find so objectionable, and they therefore have disappeared completely from the realm of public debate. That's what happens when you have full consensus between the two political parties. What is happening at Guantanamo with these commissions is really quite extraordinary, because it is an attack on every single precept of Western justice that we have long considered to be the hallmark of any decent society. Things like allowing lawyers to have access to their clients, to have access to evidence, to be able to have that aired in open court. What you really have is a process designed for two things: to ensure guilt, to ensure it no matter what the evidence is, and more importantly, to suppress relevant evidence that's embarrassing to the United States. So these defendants are not permitted to talk about or to introduce evidence concerning the extraordinarily oppressive, torturous treatment to which they were subjected that impacts the statements that they gave that are to be used against them, that impacts the entire notion of justice surrounding the trial. You have secret evidence. You have evidence that is from witnesses that cannot be confronted. It is an extraordinary travesty of everything that we claim to believe in, but because it's the Democrats doing it, the Republicans fully on board, it has disappeared from public discourse.
I wanted to ask you about WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who spoke by video link at a side meeting of the UN General Assembly from inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he's taken refuge. Of course, Ecuador has granted him diplomatic asylum to prevent him from being extradited to Sweden. He is concerned about being sent to Sweden to answer questions about two women who have said that he sexually abused them, because he's concerned that Sweden will then extradite him to the United States, where he's concerned he could potentially face charges relating to WikiLeaks. This is an excerpt of his address at the UN.
The U.S. administration is in trying to erect a national regime of secrecy, a national regime of obfuscation, a regime where any government employee revealing sensitive information to a media organization can be sentenced to death, life imprisonment, or espionage, and journalists from the media organization with them. We should not underestimate the scale of the investigation which has happened into WikiLeaks.
That's WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Glenn Greenwald, your final comment. Of course, these kinds of issues, from Guantanamo to Julian Assange, well, we don't know. In the town hall meeting, I suppose they could be asked, but what do you think?
Right. I think I can't imagine Candy Crowley choosing a question that relates to the war on whistleblowers or Julian Assange or secrecy. But just think about that contrast. When Daniel Ellsberg was prosecuted by the Nixon administration, this was a huge story. It went to the Supreme Court. Liberals and progressives undertook his cause. He became a symbol of heroism and bravery. Here you have WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning facing exactly the same treatment, and it's completely disappeared from public discourse. Progressives could not care less, even though, as every investigative journalist who does real work, including at major newspapers, will tell you, this has all created an incredible climate of fear that not only deters and intimidates their sources out of whistleblowing, but intimidates a lot of journalists as well, and that's what it's designed to do. So you have this massive attack on transparency, this bolstering of secrecy, this undermining of investigative journalism, all concentrated within the WikiLeaks case, specifically the broader war on whistleblowers, and this too will be ignored because both parties could not be more fully on board with it than if they tried.
We want to thank you, Glenn Greenwald, for being with us, columnist and blogger for The Guardian newspaper, author of With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. We will link to your latest piece at The Guardian. And George Farah, thanks so much for joining us. Final question. The organizations that are trying to open these debates and wrest control away from this private corporation, which is the Commission on Presidential Debates?
We are making some actual ground. For the first time, we've convinced 3 of the 10 corporate sponsors that are financing the Commission on Presidential Debates to peel off. We have
YWCA pulled out.
YWCA, Philips Electronics, and BBH Advertising all pulled their support from the Commission on Presidential Debates. This is totally unprecedented. We're resulting in the consistent process of actually making these secret contracts public. The media is beginning to really understand that this is a bipartisan corporation that doesn't serve the interest of an electorate in which 40% of the voting population is independent. So I think it's just a matter of time, maybe, before we actually break the monopoly of the Commission on Presidential Debates.
We're going to leave it there. I want to thank you for being with us, George Farah, founder and executive director of Open Debates, author of No Debate, How the Republican and Democratic Parties Secretly Control the Presidential Debates. Again, Democracy Now! Will be broadcasting live from Hofstra with our own community forum, as well as broadcasting the town hall debate. You can start tuning in at 8 p.m. at democracynow.org. That's 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or tune into your radio or television station that is broadcasting us. And tomorrow morning, a special 2-hour broadcast of Democracy Now!, where we'll be joined by 3 third-party candidates. They will answer the same questions put to the major party presidential candidates at Hofstra. So you'll hear all. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Back in a minute.
Te recuerdo, Amanda, la calle mojada, corriendo a la fábrica donde trabajaba Manuel. La sonrisa ancha, la lluvia en el pelo, no importaba nada, ibas a encontrarte con él, con él, con él, con él, con él. Son 5 minutos, la vida es eterna en 5 minutos. Suena la sirena, de vuelta al trabajo, y tú caminando, lo iluminas todo, los 5 minutos te hacen florecer. Te recuerdo, Amanda, la calle mojada, corriendo a la fábrica donde trabajaba Manuel. La sonrisa ancha, la lluvia en el pelo, no importaba nada. Ibas a encontrarte con él, con él, con él, con él, con él, que partió a la sierra, que nunca hizo daño, que partió a la sierra, y en 5 minutos quedó destrozado. Suena la sirena, de vuelta al trabajo, muchos no volvieron. Tampoco Manuel. Te recuerdo, Amanda, la calle mojada, corriendo a la fábrica.
Te recuerdo, Amanda, by Victor Jara. I remember you, Amanda. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
2 leaders of the Chilean student movement are in the United States this week, where they will be awarded the 2012 Letelier Moffitt Human Rights Award. The prize is named for the Chilean diplomat Orlando Letelier and his colleague Ronnie Carbon Moffitt, who were murdered in Washington by agents of the U.S.-backed Chilean dictator General Augusto Pinochet in September 1976. Over the past year, the Chilean students' movement has led some of the largest protests in Chile since the days of opposition marches to Pinochet a generation ago. The movement has rallied hundreds of thousands into the streets of Santiago and other major cities to demand greater access to affordable university education, as well as deeper structural changes in Chile. The country has the highest per capita income in the region, but also one of the most unequal distributions of wealth.
Joining us are Noam Titelman, the current president of the Catholic University Student Federation. He's one of the main leaders of the Chilean student protest, and he's a student in commercial engineering and Spanish literature at the Catholic University of Chile in Santiago. We are also joined by Camila Vallejo, Vice President of the University of Chile Student Federation from late 2010 through 2011. She was president of the organization and has been a main spokesperson for the National Student Federation, the Confederation of Chilean Students. Camila Vallejo is also a member of the Central Committee of the Chilean Communist Youth and a geography student at the University of Chile in Santiago. Her interpreter is Marcial Godoy, and we welcome you all to Democracy Now! Noam, let's begin with you. Talk about the significance of the movement and what is taking place now in Chile. In the United States, it is hard enough to get protests covered in the United States, let alone in Chile, no matter how significant they are.
Yes, I think the first thing to understand is that we have a very special educational system which was imposed during the 1980s during the Pinochet dictatorship, which has one basic principle, and it's that the market always works. And we've found out that obviously it's not that way always. And what we've seen is that, for example, while our public education is dying, we have only 36% of students going to public schools. Here in the States, it's almost 90%. It's really a very special example of how privatized can a state become. And all of this started accumulating a lot of problems, a lot of inequalities, and this exploded many occasions during the last decades. But during the 2011, it had a special massification of this issue, and we saw almost all of schools and universities of the country paralyzed for almost 6 months, over 1 million people in the streets. And we even saw some students willingly losing their academic year, many thousands of them. And all of this is obviously because something is not working with this extremely privatized educational system.
Camila Vallejo, can you talk about how it is that the movement was able to mobilize such large numbers of people?
¿Cómo fue que el movimiento fue capaz de movilizar números tan grandes de personas?
Bueno, primero creo importante señalar a propósito del premio que estamos recibiendo por parte de la Fundación Letelier Maffitt, que es muy simbólico, dado que Orlando Letelier fue una de las primeras personas que advirtió las consecuencias que iba a tener la implementación del modelo neoliberal en Chile por medio de la dictadura militar.
First, I want to remark, in light of the Letelier Moffitt Prize that we're receiving, that Orlando Letelier was one of the first to warn about what would come with the implementation of neoliberal policies during the dictatorship.
Él señalaba que por medio de la fuerza en Chile no solamente se iba a instaurar una economía de libre mercado, sino que una sociedad de libre mercado, y que este iba a tocar incluso lo que antes era considerado derechos básicos como la salud, la educación o el seguro social.
He warned that through violence in Chile there would not only be a sort of a market society put in place, but actually that all many things that were previously considered basic rights would be turned into a neoliberal goods.
And Orlando Letelier was the former Chilean ambassador to the United States who was blown up in a car bomb on Embassy Row in Washington, D.C. in 1976.
Right. Y que eso iba a terminar haciendo que las familias no solamente tuvieran que pagar por los servicios básicos, sino que incluso por los derechos, a tal punto que ante la desigualdad que existe en Chile iban a tener que endeudarse para acceder a eso. Eso ha terminado en un profundo malestar de la sociedad que desembocó esta movilización a través de la educación.
And that these circumstances would end in the privatization of basic rights and of basic goods, and that families would have to become indebted to procure these basic things, and that's what led really in Chile to these massive protests.
Camila Vallejo and Noam Tiedemann, we have to end it there, but we'll continue in a post-show discussion and post it online at democracynow.org. That does it for our broadcast. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website, democracynow.org. Again, we'll be at Hofstra University broadcasting the debate tonight. You can go to our website at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow morning, a special 2-hour broadcast, including third-party voices in the debate. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berger, Nate Felser, Martin, and Steve.